Get him off the payroll. The words left Emily Carter's mouth with the same clinical precision she applied to every decision she made in the glass-walled office on the 12th floor. She did not look up from the spreadsheet on her screen. She did not pause to consider the name on the paper her head of human resources had set on the corner of her desk. She simply signed the termination notice, slid it back across the polished surface, and returned her attention to the restructuring projections that had consumed the better part of her week. In her mind, the matter was already resolved. One line item removed from a cost column that had been bleeding the company for longer than anyone had bothered to address. The man in the worn gray uniform who pushed a mop along the hallway outside her window every morning was, in the language of the quarterly review, a redundancy. In the language Emily had taught herself to speak since taking the helm of Carter Technologies 14 months ago, he was inefficiency made visible. Emily Carter was 32 years old, and she had inherited a company that did not entirely believe in her. That was the most honest way to describe the arrangement. When her father, David Carter, died of a heart attack 18 months ago, the board of directors had spent 3 weeks debating whether to bring in an outside executive before finally, reluctantly, agreeing to let his daughter take the title. They had offered their condolences at the funeral and their reservations in the boardroom, sometimes in the same breath. She had sat at the head of the table and listened to every concern, every carefully worded suggestion that perhaps a co-CEO arrangement might ease the transition, every sideways glance exchanged between men who had known her father and saw in her only a woman 30 years younger than the job seemed to require. She had listened, and she had taken notes, and then she had gone home to the house she had grown up in and sat alone in her father's study for a long time without turning on the lights. She had not cried. That surprised her. In the weeks that followed, she had expected grief to arrive with more force, to flatten her the way it had when her mother died when Emily was 19. Instead, it had come in quieter forms, the way she sometimes reached for her phone to call him before remembering, the way certain conference rooms still smelled faintly of the coffee he preferred, the way the company itself felt like a presence that was somehow both his and hers and neither. She grieved, but she also worked, and the working helped, and slowly the grief became something she carried rather than something that carried her. Carter Technologies had been founded in 1989, a small electronics manufacturing operation that her father had built from a rented workshop into a company employing over 800 people across 3 facilities. For 35 years it had made components, circuit boards, sensor arrays, precision-manufactured parts that ended up inside medical devices, industrial equipment, and consumer electronics. It was not a glamorous business. It was not the kind of company that made headlines or attracted venture capital or got profiled in magazines. It made things that worked, sold them to people who needed them to work, and had built a quiet, durable reputation over decades of doing exactly that. Her father had been proud of this in a way that Emily had not always understood when she was young, before she came to recognize that durability was its own form of excellence. The board's skepticism had sharpened her. She arrived at every meeting over-prepared, with data where others offered instinct and contingency plans, where others assumed smooth sailing. She commissioned independent audits of every department. She hired a consulting firm to evaluate operational efficiency. She read every contract the company had signed in the past 5 years. She studied the company's founding-era documents, or thought she did. She had read the summaries and the historical profiles, the authorized account, without ever opening the box on the 4th floor that would have told her a different story. And when the reports came back with their predictable recommendations, streamline, automate, reduce headcount in roles that technology had made redundant, she had implemented them with a thoroughness that impressed even the directors who had doubted her most visibly. She was building a record. She was constructing, quarterly result by quarterly result, the proof that she belonged in the chair she occupied. She understood, in an abstract way, that this focus had costs, that the metrics she optimized did not always capture everything that mattered, but she had decided, consciously and deliberately, that she could not afford to be sentimental, not yet, not until she had earned the authority that would let her be something more than relentlessly competent. The termination list had been compiled by her HR director, cross-referenced against the automation roadmap, and reviewed by Emily herself on a Tuesday afternoon in March. 43 positions identified for elimination, mostly in maintenance, logistics, and clerical functions, where software and machinery were rendering manual labor superfluous. The business case was solid. The savings were real. She had signed every notice on the list in a single sitting, including the one for Michael Turner, age 57, janitor, 12 years of service, no specialized credentials listed in his file, no performance reviews that distinguished him from any other employee who showed up, did the required work, and went home. He was, by every measure her spreadsheet recognized, unremarkable. What the spreadsheet did not record was that Michael Turner knew where every pipe in the building ran, that he could diagnose a failing HVAC compressor by sound alone, that he had, on at least a dozen occasions over the past decade, caught problems in the building's infrastructure before they became emergencies: a slow gas leak near the server room, a corroded fitting in the sprinkler system, a electrical panel that was drawing power irregularly in a way that eventually would have caused a fire. The spreadsheet did not record that he arrived 45 minutes before his shift every morning, or that he stayed late without claiming overtime, or that new employees in every department somehow found their way to him when they needed to understand how things actually worked, as opposed to how the organizational chart suggested they should work. The spreadsheet recorded his salary, his tenure, his job classification, and his absence of a college degree. Emily had read it for approximately 90 seconds before making her decision. She would not know any of this yet. That understanding was still 3 days away. Michael Turner received his termination notice on a Thursday morning, delivered by the HR director, Karen Walsh, who had been with the company for 9 years and who genuinely did not want to be in the room. Karen had drafted the notice herself, triple-checked the severance calculation, and spent the previous evening composing and deleting various versions of what she might say to soften it. In the end, she sat across from Michael in the small HR conference room on the second floor and slid the envelope across the table and told him she was sorry, because she was, and that the decision had come from the executive level as part of the broader restructuring, because it had, and that he would have 2 weeks of paid transition time, plus the standard severance package based on his years of service. Michael picked up the envelope. He read the letter inside at a speed that suggested he was not surprised by its existence. Then he set it down on the table and folded his hands, and Karen braced herself for the conversation she had been dreading, the questions, the arguments, the pain that she had watched play out in this room more times than she cared to count over the past 2 months. He said, "Is there anything you need from me before I go? Keys, access cards, anything like that?" Karen blinked. "We'll collect your badge at checkout. There's a checklist." "All right." He nodded, unhurried. "I want to be sure the maintenance log is up to date before I leave. There are a few things flagged that whoever comes after me should know about. The cooling unit on the 3rd floor is running warm, not critical yet, but it will be in about 6 weeks if it isn't serviced, and there's a drain in the loading bay that backs up when it rains heavily. I've been managing it manually, but there's a permanent fix that involves clearing about 18 inches of root growth from the exterior line." Karen stared at him. "I'll make sure that's passed along. Thank you." He stood, retrieved his envelope, and extended his hand across the table. "You've always been fair to me, Karen. I appreciate that." She shook his hand and did not entirely trust herself to speak. Word traveled through Carter Technologies the way it always did, not through official channels, but through the break room and the corridor, and the particular frequency of concerned glances between people who had worked alongside each other long enough to communicate in shorthand. By noon, the news of Michael Turner's termination had reached most of the floor. The reactions varied. Some employees had already processed the broader list of cuts, with the resigned pragmatism of people who understood that restructuring was an institutional event rather than a personal one. Others took Michael's dismissal more personally, because Michael was not an abstraction. He was the man who had helped the night shift supervisor change a tire in the parking lot on a January evening 2 years ago. He was the person who left coffee near the security desk during early morning deliveries without being asked. He was, in the small ecosystem of an 800-person company, the kind of presence that people took for granted until it was removed, at which point they suddenly understood what it had been providing. 3 employees went so far as to draft a petition, which circulated briefly before someone with better judgment pointed out that the decision had already been made, and that appealing it would likely accomplish nothing except drawing attention the signatories could not afford in the current climate. The petition was quietly abandoned. The discontent remained, diffuse and unvoiced, in the way institutional discontent usually does. Emily did not hear about the petition. She heard, through Karen, that there had been some emotional responses to the Turner termination, which she logged as expected, and did not investigate further. She had scheduled meetings about the termination that afternoon, and Michael himself had requested a brief meeting with her, not to dispute the decision. Karen had been careful to clarify, just to speak with her directly. Emily had agreed, mostly because she respected the formality of it, and because she expected it to take 10 minutes. Michael arrived at her office at 4 in the afternoon. He wore his work uniform, as he always did, because it was a work day, and he was still technically employed for 2 more weeks, and that was the kind of person he was. Emily gestured to the chair across her desk and told him, with the measured courtesy she extended to all separating employees, that she appreciated his service and wished him well. He thanked her. He said nothing about the years he had spent in the building, nothing about the institutional knowledge leaving with him, nothing about fairness or its absence. He did not ask her to reconsider. He said, "I understand the reasoning. If you believe it's the right direction for the company, I respect that. I hope it goes well." Emily had prepared, without realizing it, for resistance. She had the calm, authoritative language ready, the acknowledgement of difficulty balanced with the clarity of purpose. She had anticipated that he might be angry or wounded, or that he might make her feel briefly guilty in the way that human beings sometimes do when they deliver unwelcome news regardless of its justification. She had not anticipated that he would simply accept it, not with resignation or bitterness, but with something that looked more like equanimity. It unsettled her in a way she could not immediately name. He collected his badge and his small box of personal items, a photograph of a young girl Emily assumed was his daughter, a coffee mug, a worn paperback that had been sitting on the shelf in the maintenance room, and walked out of Carter Technologies on a Thursday afternoon in March. And nobody knew, least of all Emily, that something was leaving with him that the company had no mechanism to replace. The anniversary celebration had been on the calendar since January. 35 years of Carter Technologies, a milestone the board had decided, deserved formal recognition, a dinner event at a hotel ballroom, with the kind of historical retrospective that such occasions demanded. Emily had assigned the planning to a committee and largely forgotten about it until her assistant reminded her, 2 weeks before the event, that she would be expected to deliver remarks. Not just polished corporate remarks about growth metrics and strategic vision, but something personal. Something that told the story of where the company came from. Emily had not thought much about where the company came from. She knew the broad outlines: her father's workshop, the early years, the gradual expansion. She had grown up around the company the way children of founders do, absorbing it peripherally without ever studying it directly. Now, with a speech to write, she found herself realizing how little she actually knew about the specifics. The founding year, the first client, the decisions that had been made in those early rooms that she had never been present for. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Jessica, tracked down the company's archival materials boxes that had been in a storage room on the 4th floor for years, transferred there when her father's original office was renovated. There were 3 of them, dense with folders and binders and the accumulated paper of an organization in its early decades. The last box had a label in her father's handwriting: Founders Archive. Emily opened it on a Saturday afternoon in her office, the building quieter than it ever was during the week. She lifted out the first layer of folders and found, beneath them, an envelope of photographs, black and white prints from the early years, then color prints from the 90s, documenting the workshop and the first office, and the expansion into the second facility. She leafed through them the way you do with pictures from a time before you existed, with curiosity and distance, recognizing her father as a younger man, someone who existed before she knew him. The photograph was near the bottom of the envelope. A color print, slightly faded at the edges, dated in pencil on the back. June, 1991. Two men standing in front of what appeared to be the original workshop, both of them grinning with the specific unself-conscious happiness of people who do not yet know everything that is coming. Her father was unmistakable on the left, younger, thinner, with the mustache he had eventually given up in the early 2000s. On the right was another man, perhaps the same age, broad-shouldered, with an open expression that communicated ease and warmth even across 35 years and the softening quality of old photographic paper. Emily looked at the photograph for a long time before she knew why it was bothering her. Then she turned it over and read what was written on the back. David and Michael, the first day. Two founders. One dream. She put the photograph down on the desk. She picked it up again. She looked at the man on the right for a long time, and the recognition that was assembling itself in her mind arrived like a verdict she had not known was being deliberated. The face was older in her memory of it. The hair was different. The context was entirely different. But the build, the eyes, the particular quality of stillness that she had noticed even in the few minutes they had spent in the same room, there was no genuine uncertainty. The man in the photograph was Michael Turner. She sat very still in her quiet office with the photograph in her hands, and the entire ordinary logic of the past 2 weeks rearranging itself around a center that was no longer where she had believed it to be. She started with the founding documents, which were in a separate folder in the same box, preserved with the care that important legal records warranted. The Articles of Incorporation, filed in the state of Michigan in August of 1989. The initial operating agreement. The shareholder registry from that first year, when there were only 2 shareholders to record, David Carter, 50%, Michael Turner, 50%, equal partners, co-founders. 2 names on the same line of the same document, with the same authority and the same stake in whatever the company became. Emily set the document down. She picked up the next one, then the next. She read for 2 hours without stopping, building a chronology from the paper evidence in front of her. And the picture it assembled was one she would spend weeks fully understanding, though the outline of it was clear enough by the time the light through the office windows had shifted from afternoon to early evening. Michael Turner had been there from the beginning, not as a participant in someone else's vision, but as an equal architect of it. His name appeared on contracts, on vendor agreements, on the early correspondence with their first manufacturing clients. His signature was beside her father's on documents that had shaped the company's structure, its partnerships, its foundational decisions. He had been, by every legal and practical measure, half of what Carter Technologies was. And then, approximately 15 years ago, he had disappeared from the record. Not gradually, not through a process of diminishing involvement, but completely. His name was absent from every document dated after 2009. The shareholder registry, the board minutes, the executive correspondence, all of it showed David Carter, sole founder. Michael Turner did not exist in the modern history of the company he had helped create. Emily was not a person given to dramatic reactions. She had been trained, by temperament and by the specific demands of the past year, to respond to surprising information with methodical inquiry rather than emotional expression. So she did not gasp, or push back from her desk, or allow herself the luxury of a moment of pure disorientation. She made a list of questions, and then she began, as soon as the following Monday permitted, to find the people who could answer them. It took her 10 days. The company's founding attorney, now retired and living in Florida, took 2 phone calls to agree to speak with her. He was a careful man who had spent his retirement carefully not thinking about certain decisions he had been party to, and his initial reluctance gave way slowly to something that resembled relief, as if the telling of it had been waiting for a listener with the right to hear it. The original CFO, who had left in 2011 and now consulted for smaller firms in the region, was more forthcoming. He had, Emily suspected, been looking for an occasion to be honest about this particular chapter for years. 2 members of the first board of directors were still alive and reachable. The first declined to discuss it. The second agreed immediately and spoke for nearly an hour. The picture they assembled, reluctantly and in fragments, was one of crisis and sacrifice on a scale that Emily had not imagined. In the winter of 2008, Carter Technologies had nearly died. The financial crisis hit their primary client sector with devastating force orders collapsed, receivables dried up, and the company's credit line evaporated within 6 months. By early 2009, they were looking at the real possibility that the business would fail, that 800 people would lose their jobs, that 30 years of accumulated work would dissolve into a bankruptcy proceeding. Her father, by all accounts, had been devastated. He had built the company with his hands, had grown it with his judgment, and now he was watching it approach the edge of an abyss with nothing sufficient to pull it back. Michael Turner had sold his stake, all of it, 50% of Carter Technologies, valued at the time even in the depressed market of 2009, at a figure that represented the majority of his personal wealth. He had sold to an investment group that came in with the liquidity the company needed to survive, on terms that allowed David Carter to retain control and the company to continue operating. And along with his shares, Michael had quietly released his claim to any formal recognition of his founding role, at the investment group's insistence that the leadership structure be simplified and David presented as the sole principal. He had also sold his house, his retirement savings, very nearly everything he had. The CFO, a careful man named Harold, had been present for the negotiations and had never entirely forgiven himself for not objecting more forcefully. He didn't have to do it the way he did, Harold said to Emily over the phone, his voice carrying the particular weight of something that had never been fully resolved. He could have negotiated better terms. He could have kept something for himself. But he said the company surviving was the point, and he didn't want to spend 6 months on terms when the company might not have 6 months. He had saved the jobs of 800 people, including her father's, by making himself financially comfortable and institutionally invisible in a single negotiation. And then he had come back. Not to a position that would have acknowledged what he had done, but to a job at the bottom of the organizational structure, because he had made a promise that Emily found recorded in her father's handwriting on 4 pages of stationery that had been folded at the bottom of the archive box. The letter was undated, but the context placed it in the months following the sale. Her father's hand was recognizable. She had seen it in birthday cards and notes her entire life, but the handwriting was more effortful than she was used to, as if each word was being set down with particular deliberateness. He wrote about the crisis, about the decision, about the debt he owed that no financial accounting could adequately express. He wrote about Michael's refusal to accept an executive role when it was offered after the investment was secured. Michael had said, according to her father's account, that 2 people standing at the front of a stage created confusion about who was running the show and that the company needed clarity more than it needed ceremony. He wrote about the agreement they had reached, which was not a formal contract but a friendship's covenant. Michael would stay in whatever role made sense operationally, and David would ensure he was treated with the dignity the arrangement deserved, even if the public record could not reflect the full truth of what he had contributed. The letter ended with a line that Emily read 3 times before she put it down. He saved us, and then he chose to become invisible so that we could continue. I don't know what kind of person does that except the best kind. The full accounting of what Michael Turner had done in his 12 years as the company's janitor required a week of conversations with employees who had been there long enough to remember. What emerged was not a dramatic narrative but an accumulation of small, consequential acts that had preserved the company's functioning in ways that never appeared in any executive report. He had noticed, 8 years ago, that a supervisor in the accounting department was submitting expense reports with falsified receipts, a modest fraud, but one that had been ongoing for years. He had brought the evidence to her father quietly, without accusation, framed as something that might have slipped through the cracks and might warrant a look. The supervisor had been let go. The matter had never become public. Her father, according to a former board member, had been certain that Michael's intervention had prevented a much larger investigation that would have damaged the company's relationship with a key client. He had, in 2014, noticed that the ventilation system in the main manufacturing floor was drawing ambient air through a compromised filter sequence. in a way that slightly exceeded allowable particulate levels. He was not an environmental engineer, but he had read the maintenance manuals and the regulatory filings with the attention of someone who understood that the building he maintained was also the building where hundreds of people spent their working days. He flagged the issue. The system was repaired before any regulatory inspection brought it to light. There were smaller things too, the ones that the employees remembered most easily. The new hire who was struggling and found Michael waiting with coffee and a patient explanation of how the building worked, where things were, who could help with what. The security guard who needed someone to cover his station for 30 minutes while he attended to a family emergency, and found Michael already standing there when he came back. The loading dock workers who had discovered, during a winter storm 3 years ago, that the heating element in their break area had failed, and arrived the following morning to find it repaired, the repair documented in the maintenance log with no name attached to it. He had never claimed credit. He had, in every instance Emily could document, either directed acknowledgement towards someone else or deflected it entirely. He had operated for 12 years as a person whose judgment and history and capability were entirely unknown to the institution he was quietly sustaining, and he had apparently found this not just acceptable but, in some way, she was still working to understand, right. Emily found him on a Wednesday afternoon through a combination of calls to former colleagues and a conversation with a former coworker from the loading dock, who mentioned, with the slightly sheepish air of someone sharing information they are not sure is helpful, that he thought Michael had taken a position at a distribution warehouse on the east side of the city. The warehouse was a large, anonymous structure off a freight road, the kind of place that processed inventory on behalf of several smaller retailers and employed a rotating workforce of people who needed work that did not require a resume that bore close examination. She drove there herself. She did not send an assistant. She did not call ahead. She parked in the lot and went in through the front entrance and asked for Michael Turner, and was told he was in the third aisle, and could she please wait while someone went to get him. She waited in a small reception area with a plastic chair and a bulletin board covered in safety notices. And she thought about what she intended to say and concluded, honestly, that she did not entirely know. He came out of the warehouse in a different uniform, this one, a reflective vest over a gray shirt, and stopped when he saw her. His expression was not what she had expected. There was no wariness, no performance of surprise. He looked at her with the same equanimity he had brought to their meeting in her office. And she had the disconcerting sense that whatever she was feeling, the guilt, the uncertainty, the strange inadequacy of being the person who had to have this conversation, was something he had anticipated and already, in some private way, accommodated. He had had weeks to think about what her finding the archive would mean. He had chosen, evidently, not to dread it. She said, "I found the archive." He said, "I wondered if you would." They stood in the parking lot of a freight warehouse on a Wednesday afternoon, and she told him what she had found, and he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he was glad she knew, and that he hoped it wasn't too much of a shock, said with a lightness that she found both kind and almost unbearable. "I made a mistake," she said. The words were harder to produce than she had expected, not because she doubted them, but because she was 32 years old and had spent the past 14 months working very hard to establish that she did not make mistakes that mattered. "I looked at your file, and I made a decision about what you were, and I was wrong. You made a reasonable decision based on the information you had," he said. "I made sure you wouldn't have the information that would have changed it. That's not entirely a defense for me." "No," he agreed, without cruelty. "I suppose it isn't." She asked if he would come back. Not in the same role, she was clear about that. She wanted his name on the company's history, where it belonged. She wanted the record corrected. He told her, with the same patient directness he brought to everything, that he would have to think about it. He did not want a ceremony. He did not want a position he had not earned in the ordinary way. He was not sure what return meant at this point in his life, and he needed to be honest about that rather than simply agreeing to make the conversation easier. She told him there was a 35th anniversary event in 3 weeks, and that she would like him to be there if he was willing, not as a guest but as someone who belonged in the room. She told him that she intended to tell the company's actual history regardless of whether he attended. because the people who had worked there deserved to know what had been kept from them. He said he would consider it, and she believed him, and she drove back through the city with both windows down and said nothing out loud the entire way. He called her 8 days later and said he would come. The hotel ballroom held 900 people, a number that would have been sufficient for a much larger company's celebration. Carter Technologies had filled it with employees across all 3 facilities, retirees who had received invitations, clients who had been offered seats, and members of the board who sat at a reserved table near the front, with the mild self-satisfaction of people expecting an agreeable evening. The lighting was warm. The tables had centerpieces that included small photographs from the company's history. A projection screen at the front of the room displayed a timeline with images and dates. Emily had spent a week preparing the presentation. Not the remarks. The remarks almost wrote themselves once she understood what she needed to say. What took time was the assembly of evidence, the photographs and documents and letters that she had scanned and organized into a coherent sequence, the chronology that she intended to project on the screen in front of 900 people, and let them draw their own conclusions from before she drew any on their behalf. Michael arrived with his daughter, a young woman named Sarah who was 23 and who held his arm with the comfortable affection of someone who had been doing exactly that her entire life. Emily met them in the lobby before the program began. Sarah knew the broad outlines of her father's history with the company, but not, Michael had told Emily, the full accounting of it. He had given her the version that omitted his own centrality, the way he seemed to have given everyone the version that omitted his own centrality. Emily introduced herself and shook both their hands and did not say anything elaborate, because the evening was going to say the elaborate things, and she wanted them to land without preamble. She spoke for 45 minutes. She had expected to be nervous and was not, which surprised her. She began with the standard historical narrative, the founding year, the early clients, the growth through the 90s, and she delivered it in the same clear, measured voice she used in board presentations, and the room settled into the attentive quiet of an audience that had come expecting exactly this kind of thing. Then she stopped, and she said that she needed to correct the historical record she had just presented, and the quality of the room's attention changed. She showed the photograph first. David and Michael, June of 1991, the 2 men grinning in front of the workshop with the specific happiness of people who do not yet know everything that is coming. She let it stay on the screen for a long moment before she began to explain it. She told them about the founding, and the equal partnership, and the crisis of 2009. She showed them the founding documents with both names on them. She told them what Michael had done during that crisis, the sale, the sacrifice, the deliberate erasure of himself from the institutional record. She showed them her father's letter. She read 2 paragraphs from it aloud, in her father's voice as best she could approximate it, and the room was very quiet. She told them what she had found in 12 years of maintenance logs and incident reports, and the testimonies of people who had worked alongside Michael without knowing who he was. She described what he had done during those years, not with drama, because the facts did not need drama, and she watched the faces of the people who had known him as the man who fixed the drain in the loading bay and made coffee appear near the security desk, and she watched them understand what they had been working beside. She said, "I reviewed his file last March, and I made a decision based on what the file contained, which was not a meaningful record of who Michael Turner is or what he has done for this company. I dismissed him, and I was wrong. The responsibility for that is mine, and I want to say so here, in the same room where the company he helped found is celebrating 35 years of existing. I want to say it because he deserves to hear it said in public, and because the people in this room deserve to know the actual story of the institution they have spent their careers inside. History belongs to everyone who was shaped by it, not only to the people whose names happen to survive the editing." She paused. I looked at a janitor. I should have looked at a founder. The silence lasted several seconds. Then it broke, not with a single sound but with many chairs moving, people turning to look at the man sitting in the 3rd row with his daughter, a sound that was not quite applause yet but was moving toward it. Sarah was gripping her father's arm with both hands. Michael sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him. His posture exactly what it had been in every room Emily had ever observed him in, still, unhurried, present. She invited him to the stage. She had asked him in advance whether he would be willing, and he had said yes with the same measured consideration he brought to everything, with the qualification that he was not interested in making a speech, and she should not expect one. He walked up the steps at the side of the stage and stood beside her under the lights. And the room rose. All 900 people, without a signal or a prompt, stood up, and the sound they made was the kind that Emily had not expected to feel physically, but did. She presented him with the company's formal acknowledgement, a framed document recognizing him as co-founder, a commitment to install his portrait alongside her father's in the lobby, a restoration of his name to the official founding record. He accepted these things with the grace of someone who had long ago stopped needing them and was receiving them now for reasons that had more to do with other people than with himself. He looked out at the room for a long moment, at the people who had worked in the building he had maintained, and something in his expression suggested that he was doing a kind of accounting that had nothing to do with shares or titles or anything the company could formally restore. He leaned toward the microphone and said 3 sentences. "Thank you for being here. The company is good because the people in it are good. I'm glad it's still here." And then he stepped back, and Emily stepped forward, and the evening moved into its final phase, with the particular quality that certain evenings acquire when something real has happened in them. A slight recalibration of everyone present, a sense that the occasion had exceeded its original purpose in a way that would remain available in memory long after the details had faded. After the program ended, when the room was filled with the noise of conversation and the movement of people who had things to say to each other, Emily found Michael at his table. Sarah had gone to find them both something to drink, and he was sitting alone with the framed document in front of him, and he was looking at it with an expression that Emily could not entirely read. She sat down beside him without being invited, which she recognized as presumptuous, and did anyway. She said, "My father used to say that the most important decisions a company makes are the ones nobody knows about." Michael smiled at that. It was a full smile, the kind that reached everything in his face. "That sounds like David. He was talking about product decisions, I think. Supply chain." She paused. "But I think it applies to people too. Most things apply to people," Michael said, "if you look at them the right way." She thought about that on the drive home. She thought about the spreadsheet and the file, and the 90 seconds she had spent with it before making her decision, and she thought about the archive box with 35 years of paper evidence of what those 90 seconds had failed to account for. She thought about her father's letter, the careful handwriting, the phrase she had been returning to since she first read it. "He saved us, and then he chose to become invisible so that we could continue." She had built, over the past 14 months, a very detailed model of what leadership required. Precision, accountability, willingness to make difficult decisions without flinching. She still believed in those things, but she was beginning to understand that the model had a gap in it, a space where something else was supposed to live, something she was having difficulty naming, but that had to do with the recognition of what cannot be measured, and the capacity to pay genuine attention to what exists beyond the record. Michael Turner had spent 12 years in a building he had helped create, maintaining it so that others could do their work, asking nothing in return that he had not already decided he could live without. He had held what he knew about himself with a lightness that Emily found, the more she thought about it, not modest but extraordinary, not the absence of self but the presence of something larger than self, a commitment that had survived the loss of everything institutional that might have reinforced it. He had been a janitor, in the most complete sense of the word's original meaning, which is to say a keeper, a guardian, someone whose work is the condition for everyone else's work being possible. Carter Technologies began its 36th year, with 2 names on the wall of its lobby, framed in matching dark wood below the company's name. David Carter and Michael Turner, founders, the founding date below them both. Employees who had been with the company for years and walked past that lobby every morning began, in the weeks following the anniversary, to look at the photographs differently. The conversations it generated were the kind that moved through the floors and departments of an 800-person company slowly but persistently, becoming part of the institutional consciousness in the particular way that true stories do when they are finally permitted to circulate. Emily restructured her evaluation process. She did not announce this, or circulate a memo about it. She simply began reading files differently, not only for the data they contained, but for what the data might be insufficient to capture. She started meeting with employees she had previously only known as line items in department budgets. She asked different questions. The answers, she was discovering, were routinely more interesting than the questions she had been asking before. Michael Turner did not return to Carter Technologies in any formal capacity. He had been offered several roles, and he had declined each of them with the same gracious, unhurried directness that characterized every interaction Emily had with him. He had a life now that was ordered around a different set of priorities: his daughter, a garden he had apparently been cultivating for years, a community involvement that did not require anyone's organizational structure to sustain it. He had made himself available to Emily as a resource and an occasional sounding board, which she found more valuable than any title she could have offered him. He came back for the lobby installation. He stood beside Emily in front of the two framed photographs and accepted the building's acknowledgement with the same equanimity he brought to everything. And then he walked with her to the elevator, and they rode up to the 12th floor together. The hallway where she had last seen him pushing a mop was carpeted now, part of the renovation she had commissioned in January. He noted the change without comment. They stood at the window at the end of the corridor, looking out over the city the way people do when they are in the middle of a conversation that does not require words to continue. She said, "Thank you for coming." He said, "Thank you for looking." She thought about that afterward, the specific weight of it, the distinction it implied between seeing and looking, between the registration of a surface and the deliberate act of attending to what is actually present. She thought about it the way she thought about her father's letter, returning to it, finding new angles in it, letting it work on her understanding in the patient way that significant things do. Carter Technologies was 35 years old, and it was still there because of decisions made in rooms where nobody took photographs. It was still there because two men in a rented workshop had decided to build something together, and because one of those men, when the something they had built was in danger of being lost, had decided that the something mattered more than his share of it. It was still there because loyalty, when it is real rather than performed, does not dissolve when the institutional recognition of it is removed. It was still there because a man had swept its floors for 12 years and watched over its corridors in the way that a person watches over something they love, without expectation of credit or return. Emily Carter was 32 years old, and she was learning what her father had apparently known for a long time, which was that the most important things in any organization are not the things that appear in the reports, that the people who hold institutions together are not always the people whose names appear on the doors, that a life can be lived in the space between ambition and recognition, in the hallways and the maintenance logs and the early mornings before anyone else arrives, with more integrity than most people ever manage in positions of formal authority. She was learning to ask different questions, not just what does this person produce, but what do they protect? Not just what credentials do they hold, but what have they held together when holding together was difficult? Not just who are they on the organizational chart, but who are they in the moments when no chart applies, in the parking lot in January, in the maintenance room at 6 in the morning, in the quiet decision to stay when leaving would have been reasonable, and no one would have blamed them. These were questions that did not fit neatly into performance frameworks or restructuring plans, but they were, she was increasingly convinced, the questions that most accurately determined the actual health of any institution. The photograph on the lobby wall showed two men on the first day, both of them grinning, both of them looking at something outside the frame, something ahead of them that they could not yet see. Emily kept a copy of it on her desk. Not framed, just a print, the kind of thing you could pick up and look at when you needed to be reminded of something. She picked it up sometimes, usually at the end of long days when the spreadsheets had been particularly insistent and the quarterly projections had narrowed her focus to numbers that felt very important until they suddenly didn't. She would look at the two men on the first day, and she would think about what it had cost to keep the thing they built alive, and what the keeping of it had looked like from the inside, not heroic, not dramatic, not visible to anyone who was not paying close enough attention. Just a man who showed up, just a man who stayed. That, she was coming to understand, was the whole of the story. And also the part that mattered most.